Now we are looking at inflation trends in Africa, 3 African countries. Ghana's CPI decelerated sharply in October, surpassing the projected 37.1%. Nigeria's inflation rate rose for the 10th consecutive month, and Botswana, meanwhile, reported lower than expected consumer inflation of just over 3%. Ridle Markus, who's Sub-Saharan Africa, a macroeconomist at Absa CIB, joins us now for his take. Ridle, always a pleasure, and a good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
All right, let's start with Ghana. I mean, Ridle, when we think of Ghana's inflation, the last print, I think, came down quite a bit. Sharply, I think, is the word that's been used. But I mean, for a country that's targeting inflation between 6 and 10%, 35.2%, still a long way to go.
It is indeed a long way to go. But keep in mind that Ghana has been coming down from 54% at the end of last year. So they've made some progress, although we believe that a lot of that progress was mainly on the back of base effects, and that we expect those base effects to continue to drive inflation lower into year end and of course into next year as well. So we think that the resilient currency, a very fairly stable currency in recent months, has also been helpful. And then, of course, the fuel prices in Ghana has come down a little over the past month or so. That has also helped. But we do think that inflation can potentially, decelerate to as low as 24% by the end of the year. And it seems like quite a large move. But again, base effects, keeping in mind that inflation topped 54% in December last year.
So let's talk about what that central bank in Ghana is doing at this point, right? I mean, we are seeing conversations about pausing in interest rate hikes somewhere around the world, actually. But with Ghana and the target range and the actual number being so far apart, can they make a similar decision?
I think so. I mean, Ghana did in the last meeting in September keep the policy rate unchanged. We think that with the MPC meeting starting on Wednesday, ending on Friday, policy rate decision on Monday next week, that they will most likely also announce an unchanged policy rate. Again, with inflation coming down, there's probably no reason that after 1,650 basis points of hikes over the past 13, 14 months, that Ghana will actually, that there's any need for hiking further. I think the fact that economic growth averaged sort of just over 3%, 3.2% in the first half of the year, slightly better than expected, I must admit, but still fairly modest and subdued compared to the pre-pandemic growth rate of Ghana, where they were often growing at over 5%. So there's just no reason to hike any further. I think, as I said, without them doing too much, inflation should go down fairly sharply, and hopefully by the end of next year we'll see it a whole lot less than 20% on its way to that 6 to 10% target range that the Bank of Ghana has. But I don't think it's going to happen over the next 2 years, but certainly maybe from 26 onwards or 25, 26 onwards, we can start looking forward to that inflation moving back into the target zone.
Let's move over to Nigeria now. Of course, Nigeria's picture a little bit different because a lot of the inflation there, is part of a huge reform program, right? So let's speak about what we are seeing in that part of West Africa.
Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, I mean, inflation did go up from 26.7 to 27.3% in October, and it's reflecting the impact of the FX reforms. We did see over 40% depreciation in the currency since those reforms were implemented in June by the new Tinubu administration. It's also reflecting the removal of the fuel subsidies. Now, I've always contended that these reforms will be very painful, and I think Tinubu himself, the president, admitted that these are painful reforms, but much needed reforms after many years of not doing these reforms. So yes, it's going to impact. Inflation is most likely to end the year just over 28%, maybe even closer to 29%. But by the second half of next year, we think inflation will come down fairly nicely, moving back towards 20% and hopefully below. And hopefully by then, we'll also see the fruits of the reforms that's being implemented at the moment.
So, I mean, just to get some clarity there, Ridle, we're not expecting this inflation that is sweeping through Nigeria to be sticky in any way. It certainly is passing through the system.
Absolutely. And again, these reforms were badly needed. A lot of the inflation is being driven by probably 2 or 3 main key factors. I mentioned the FX, but that obviously, is driving the fuel prices. The removal of the subsidy is driving the fuel prices, and those are driving, through the second round impact is also driving food prices. Of course, Nigeria is struggling with insecurity as well in food producing areas, and that just makes the production of food so much more difficult. But as I said, I think that we are probably 2 or 3 months away from an inflation peaking in Nigeria, and that we are looking forward to much lower inflation, particularly in the second half of next year. Unfortunately, it's a pity that the MPC meeting scheduled for this week has been postponed or delayed. We don't know when it's going to happen. So we're not going to get the message from the central bank as to how they feel about the inflation path. But besides that, I do think that inflation is probably close to peaking.
And let's talk about Botswana now. Botswana also seeing the kind of inflation that is actually under control, I would say. Ridle, keen to get your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, so Botswana inflation obviously moved down to 1.5%, slightly lower, and now it jumped to 3.2% in September, and then to 3.4% in October. And that was just driven by fuel prices. But there were large fuel price cuts middle of last week, or towards the end of last week, and I think that will also help contain inflationary pressures as we move into the end of the year. I don't think inflation is going to go much more than 3.5%, though, again, base effects early next year could see inflation go up to 5% perhaps in Botswana, but still comfortably within the 3 to 6% target band. And I just don't think that Botswana will hike the policy rate anytime soon, especially with inflation remaining comfortably within that target band. We see the policy rate being unchanged throughout the whole of next year.
Yeah, I'm actually keen to find out, Ridle, why are we expecting inflation to increase a little bit and closer to the top of that target range?
So again, for Botswana, we as I said, it's going to get closer to the target range. There's a couple of markets, of course, that are worrying. We know that inflation in Zambia and Angola is on the up, in addition to Nigeria. So there's a couple of exceptions around the region. And also Zambia MPC meeting later this week, we expect a policy rate hike on Wednesday there. But for most of the other countries, Botswana, Namibia, etc., we do think that inflation will be fairly contained. And we hope that there won't be any further policy rate increases in these markets. In fact, a few of these markets, including markets such as Ghana, can probably start to look forward to policy rate cuts within the next couple of months. Maybe not first quarter next year, but certainly by the middle of next year, we're going to see a whole lot of our markets. Hopefully, if there's no surprises from the external environment, we are hoping to see some policy rate cuts that will bring some relief to consumers towards the middle of next year.
Well, Ridle, it's always a pleasure hearing from you. Thank you so much for all these insights this afternoon. That was Ridle Markus, Sub-Saharan African macroeconomist at Absa CIB.